Government after government in the UK have promised to get legal immigration down and have failed. The Labour Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, says this time will be different. Will it? That's what we'll be asking on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James, and we've actually popped down to Westminster for this part of the podcast because there was a big speech here today from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, in which he promised what he called a controlled, selective and fair immigration system, promising to bring down the number of people arriving in the country. And just to rattle through two or three of the things he said. First of all, he said migration would fall significantly over the next 4 years. He didn't say exactly by how much. He announced plans to ban the recruitment overseas of care workers and also to tighten access to skilled worker visas. And what else? He warned that without fair rules, we risked becoming, in his words, a nation of strangers. And we can talk about all that now with the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper. Thank you so much for coming on to Newscast.
Really good to see you.
Nice to see you. Now, let's just be clear. We are talking about legal migration in the context of all of this today, aren't we? Not illegal migration. Let's get that right from the start.
That's right. And we're also at the same time passing new legislation on border security, which includes new counter-terrorism powers to go after criminal gangs, to tackle the dangerous small boats that undermine border security. So we have other policies underway for that, and we will set out further measures around asylum and border security as well later on in the year. But this particular white paper is about how we reform the legal migration system, how we basically bring the immigration system back under control.
Right. And before we get into the details of that, I just wonder if you encounter what we've encountered today. So we've gone out and spoken to people on the streets and asked them about it. And in one case, a colleague of mine was saying every time you ask and you say this is about legal migration, they answer on illegal migration. You have to keep drawing them back. I just wonder if that's your experience as a politician engaging with constituents and other people.
Well, I think you have to do both. Look, there is serious concerns about the issues around border security. We have small boats end up undermining that border security and also putting lives at risk as well. So that is why it is the huge priority for this government to go after the criminal gangs who are organising this, to get the order back and deal with some of the chaos in the asylum system and to end asylum hotels. Alongside that, we also need to deal with the fact that net migration, legal migration, quadrupled in the space of just 4 years.
And
so
just
we
to be
have
clear,
to address that as well.
Let's just remind newscasters, and many will know already, but net migration, the number of people coming minus the number of people leaving.
Right.
In really simple terms, just to put it in simple terms.
Yes.
And that quadrupled.
Yes.
And when you look at trying to bring that down, is there a country in the world that you can look at and say they've got this right? We're looking at them as quite a good model.
Well, I think other countries haven't seen that huge increase that we had in net migration in such a short period of time, to quadruple in the space of 4 years, in a period where the government was actually saying they were going to bring net migration down. In fact, they did the opposite to such a huge scale. But it was linked to policy decisions that they made that encouraged overseas recruitment. At the same time as training in the UK was being cut, we actually had incentives being brought in. Employers were actually told they would get a 20% discount on wages if they recruited in shortage occupations from abroad and wouldn't have to pay the going rate. Well, that is just completely counterproductive, really damaging, and means that we're not doing the training and skills that we need in the UK. And too often employers were being encouraged to just switch to immigration instead. Bad for the immigration system and also bad for the economy.
In your view, are there too many foreigners in this country legally?
People have come to the UK through very many years, through generations, to contribute to our society, to contribute to our economy. So we need to respect and recognise the work that doctors do in our National Health Service, the work that people do in all of our public services, setting up small businesses, coming as international students. But we also have to have a system that is controlled. So we have said net migration needs to come down.
So the answer is yes. You think there are too many foreigners in this country?
I think you have to recognise when people have come here, they've arrived here lawfully, they are contributing to our country and we need to respect that. But we also need to ensure that net migration comes down, because it has been, quadrupling. I mean, that is a huge increase. That's been a free market experiment the Conservatives brought in. Got to get that back under control. Bring those numbers down. Make sure that we've got a properly controlled and managed system. And we're also boosting training and skills in the UK.
I will come on to that, and because I think it's obviously really important, and right at the heart of what you're talking about is the workforce here ready and able to step up? But we'll come on to that. I just want to ask you about one thing. This island of strangers quote. The Prime Minister said today, we risked becoming an island of strangers if the rules weren't followed. Have you felt like that this is in danger of becoming an island of strangers, personally?
Well, I think the point the Prime Minister's making is that you need proper rules, and you need proper rules to be followed. You need to make sure that we've got a working system, because if you haven't, if there's a sense that the rules aren't being respected and enforced, that ends up undermining community cohesion. It undermines the support and confidence and trust in the whole system. And we also need to ensure that when people are coming to the UK, they can speak English and can be part of communities that we can support integration. I think that's a good thing. So one of the changes we're making, for example, is to say that if somebody's coming on a skilled worker visa, for example, if they are bringing a partner with them, actually the partner also needs to be able to speak English. Otherwise, there's a risk that they will be isolated and that you will undermine that integration.
So just to understand what this island of strangers that the Prime Minister's so worried about looks like, it's about walking down the street and hearing foreign languages. Is that right? No,
we're a very diverse country. We have people visiting from all over the world as part of our tourism industry.
Okay, so it's about walking down a street in a residential neighbourhood and hearing foreign languages.
No, as part of our economy, as part of our public services, we have had people come to our country through very many years, and that's always been important. That's an important part of who we are.
Yeah, I don't want to have an argument with you. I just want to understand who the strangers are and why they feel like strangers or might feel like strangers.
I think the point is that we want to have that sense of cohesion around people being able to support integration, and also to all support the same shared rules. Those rules will be about making sure, for example, that where actually there is misuse of the visa system, there's proper enforcement in place, rather than just turning our backs on that, making sure that those rules are respected and enforced, making sure that high standards are maintained. So, for example, we're alongside this introducing a new Windrush Commissioner to make sure that the Home Office also has high standards, because there have been failures by the Home Office in the past. So this is a combination of things to make sure that we can rebuild trust and confidence in a system that really, I think, has got into the most chaotic mess over the last 4 or 5 years, and in a way that has damaged confidence and trust.
So let me just read you this tweet from the former Shadow Chancellor, Labour's John McDonnell, who says, I'm the grandson of an Irish migrant living in one of the most diverse communities in the country. We get along together pretty well, with every section of the community making its contribution. Talk of an island of strangers shockingly echoes the divisive language of Enoch Powell, the far-right or right-wing politician, depending on your perspective, whose 1968 Rivers of Blood speech caused so much controversy. You're telling me that is that a coincidence? The strangers line in that infamous speech to some people, and the Prime Minister using strangers in his speech today. Is that a coincidence?
No, I think the point about what we're doing is to put community cohesion at the heart of the White Paper, to say that we want our communities to be strong, to be recognising the huge contribution. I think, as we said many times throughout the White Paper and also through the statement in Parliament.
So it's
that we've had people being
not
part of our countries, people being part of our country for a very long time, contributing, working hard. It's whether that is from our NHS or in my constituency, we had people came to work in the coal mines. We've also had people come to work in our armed forces. All of that is hugely important. But if you look at what happened to net migration over the last 4 or 5 years, that is a serious problem. And there's no getting around that. It was a serious problem that you had the 4-fold increase in net migration at the same time as skills and training in the UK were cut. That is the real problem.
But is that language designed to echo Enoch Powell?
I think the whole point about what the Prime Minister was saying this morning is that we want the shared rules to be respected and we want confidence in a migration system. And you can't have that when you have a system that, where you've got the government had really just lost control over the whole system, over low-skilled migration, for example, which had increased substantially, over problems around enforcement, where there had been a big drop in returns. It's really important that you have respect for the system.
An immigration system that seems almost designed to permit abuse. That was Powell's line.
Well, I think it's right to tackle misuse and abuse.
So you agree with Enoch Powell?
Well, I think everybody would agree with tackling misuse. I don't think you would be suggesting that we should not tackle misuse. The overwhelming majority of people who come to the UK do so lawfully, abide by the immigration system and recognise that. But where there is misuse, and we have seen it, then it's really important that that's tackled and that is respected.
Right. So let's look at a specific area that you've talked about, and that's the care sector. Are there currently too many legal migrants working in that sector?
People have come to work in our care service, particularly after COVID, and are doing really important jobs looking after our loved ones. And that is a hugely important, and we should respect those workers for the job that they do. But we also need to recognise that the way in which the social care visa was introduced led to this really big increase in overseas recruitment with no proper standards in place and huge exploitation. I talked to people who come to work in jobs in the UK that turned out not to exist, or finding that they were ending up being charged themselves, or finding that they were working maybe just 2 days a week and couldn't actually support themselves as a result of the job that they had. So that system has been subject to massive exploitation. That's why we think we need to end the overseas recruitment of care workers. But for those care workers who were displaced, who came to work here, they were displaced as a result of when the new higher standards were brought in, then they should be able to, care homes should be able to recruit those workers so that they can continue to work in the UK.
And as you know, I'm sure you've heard today, and I was listening to some of the debate that you were just participating in. In fact, more than participating in, it was your debate in the House of Commons. Quite a lot of concern from some care home workers, and we're hearing that through various questions. And I wonder if we could just, it's really quick, just listen to a quick clip. This is Amy Clark, a commercial director for a care home in Cornwall, and she was speaking on BBC Radio 4 this morning.
The big problem that we would have is if we weren't able to recruit any overseas staff, because recruiting locally is very, very difficult. We advertise all our roles locally. We either get no applicants at all, or people apply and then don't turn up for interview.
What do you think of that?
So, and I don't want to speak for Amy but I think I heard that interview this morning, and I think one of the points that she made was that it wasn't, the biggest problem was not actually not being able to recruit from abroad. It would be being able to recruit existing care workers who were here already in the UK. That was the most important thing. We're continuing with that. So, for example, if there are people who are here who are on other visas, who are lawfully able to work in the UK, they could still be recruited onto a care worker visa. Or if there are people who are on care worker visas already, those visas can be extended. So the thing we are changing is to close the overseas recruitment of care workers. That's the area where I think we really need to shift now from having this continual high level of overseas recruitment and start focusing on getting a fair pay agreement in place in the UK and start focusing on improving the domestic recruitment.
Yes, exactly. So, and that means you would say, would you British workers, more British workers, Indigenous British workers working in care homes, for example, as well? Is that what you would like to see, training people up?
UK residents, we want to be able to, we want them to be, the care homes to be able to recruit domestically. Some people who they will be recruiting might be people who came previously on a care worker visa and then lost their visa because of the really dodgy, the rogue employers that we had who were exploiting the system.
But you'll have heard people worried about, I mean, we heard it there, a worry that there just aren't the applicants out there. And just quickly, we had this message from newscaster Sheila, who was saying to us, and we've summarised this because quite a lot in it. So in short, it's not that short, but shortish, in order to get work in the care sector, you'll need a traceable work record, pretty much no criminal record ever. To be healthy and fit, it's hard graft, she says. Usually you'll need to be able to work year-round, 24/7 shifts. If you need childcare, it's difficult, nigh on impossible. She says shifts are often over 12 hours, a lot of childcare cost, might not be available for pickups and drop-offs at school. Often you have to use your own car between calls, a clean licence, a reliable car, mileage rates and time are not included. You get the idea. Sheila's point is there's quite a lot to do to train people up, to help people get into those jobs. Are you confident that you can do that and that there is the pool of labour in the UK willing to do this really hard job?
It is a hard job, and it's a job where we should be respecting the people who do that job. That's why we've been clear we need to bring in a fair pay agreement, because some of the terms and conditions for some of the workers end up being unfair or exploitative. We need to make sure we're respecting people doing those jobs. But bear in mind, we didn't have this social care visa a few years ago. It was brought in, and we saw then a really big increase in the way that this care visa was used, including by rogue employers who ended up with, the fact that we had 39,000 people who came in good faith to do social care work on a care worker visa, and actually the employer that had supposedly recruited them turned out to be rogue or turned out not to be meeting proper standards, and those workers ended up being displaced. That's nearly 40,000 people. That shows what a problem there was with the social care visa, and that's why we think it's really important that we actually go to the heart of the problem. We can't just keep thinking that wherever the labour market problems are, well, the answer is always to say we focus on immigration rather than tackling the problems, whether that is about fair pay, whether that is about training. For example, construction is another example where construction will stay on the temporary shortage list because we do need construction workers. But alongside that, we're bringing in the new training to train up 60,000 more construction workers, part of having a workforce strategy. So you do the two things. We have they recognise in the migration system that there will be shortages, but they should be temporary while you have a workforce strategy in place to properly train up as well.
So just to zoom out, to finish, I know you're busy, we've got other things to do. To zoom out to finish, so you're saying, right, we need to do all of these things to get more people into work. And the government's also saying, in some respects, it's going to cut benefits to try to push people into work, and you want to reduce migration. But my question is, I can see if you could argue whether or not it's going to work. It's not for me to say, but I can see how you can make a case that, well, in the immediate future, we might be able to do this. But the UK has an ageing population and a shrinking workforce as a proportion of its population. So in the longer run, is it not going to be the case that we will come back to this problem and need migrants to come in and help in the future unless we have, say, a higher fertility rate or dramatically increased productivity, which no government seems to have been able to deliver for years and years and years?
Well, I guess I would just come back to one of the points from the very beginning. These numbers quadrupled in the space of just 4 years. And that was a very steep increase in the space of a very short period of time, where it was really this combination of the loosening controls, the encouraging employers to recruit from abroad rather than training at home. Actually, we can do far more to train. And at a time when training was cut, at a time when more people ended up inactive, not in either training or in work, and we saw the big increase in overseas recruitment, and also a significant increase in exploitation as well. We will always benefit from international talent, from people coming to this country to work incredibly hard, to be part of our communities, part of working in our public services, founding some of our biggest businesses and being part of our universities. That will always be important. It's because it's important that the system has to be properly managed and controlled. It's because it's important you have to have these proper reforms in place, because otherwise, if confidence in the system just falls apart, then you don't have a system that's in anybody's interests. That's what we want to do, is restore that management and control, make sure that we've got a fair system that is sustainable for the future.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. Thanks a lot for coming into Newscast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, it's just over a month, believe it or not, since Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden of the White House and stunned the world, really, by announcing these tariffs, taxes on imports, essentially, left, right and centre, all around the world. And after that, of course, it all ramped up between the United States and China, particularly. And we've all been asking the question since then, who will fold first in this trade war? And now we have a deal between Beijing and Washington. Looks like probably the biggest moment since all of this began. And so we can try to answer the question. I'm not saying we can answer it, but we'll try to answer the question. Do we know who folded first? And to do that, we're joined by our economics editor, Faisal Islam. Hi, Faisal.
Nice to be here.
As always. And Laura Bicker is on the line from Beijing, our China correspondent. Hi, Laura.
Hello, James. How are you doing?
I am very well. Right. Let's start, Faisal. Can I just wind us back a little bit? And then we'll maybe just go through the tariffs and where we got to. Where were we with tariffs between China and the US before Donald Trump took office?
So there were some ongoing tariffs and restrictions from the Trump administration one, which there was a deal which Biden didn't hugely kind of enforce. He had instigated these fentanyl tariffs when he got in, which is we will come back to. It was a separate bucket, but this really blows up on so-called Liberation Day.
Yes, exactly. So the fentanyl tariffs because he was complaining about that illegal drug coming into the US, and as you say, we'll come back to that. But so my point was there were some existing tariffs. Though it was not free trade, untrammeled free trade between the US and China. Until Liberation Day, so-called, self-styled Donald Trump's Liberation Day. Just remind us, Faisal, what happened then.
Yes, and it's important to remember this number too, because one of the things in trying to unpick this is we're trying to work out who blinked first. But what happens on Liberation Day, the famous chart, and with all the numbers, and China came in at 34%, which then they retaliate to, and you then get this literal definition of a tit-for-tat escalation between the two biggest economies in the world. And sort of overwhelmingly, China exports more to the US than the other way round. However, I think the important thing to remember at this point, because the cast of the personnel changes on the US side, which is a really important part of this story. At this point, this guy, Pete Navarro, the trade advisor, and others in the administration, their view is because the US is the deficit country and China has the surplus, so it sells more, it will always lose this trade war, right? That's the lesson and the message of history that the Americans were trying to apply. That it's the deficit country, it's the buyer country, if you like, that has all the power. Now that was always rather simplistic, and I think, if I fast forward to the end of this conversation, we're going to fill in the gaps, is what we've learned is that these days, that leverage, that, if you like, that power, that negotiating power is pretty equal.
And so just to round off this introduction as to how we got here, what's happened today? Where are we now?
So we have seen, and again, we've seen a sort of slightly complicated and involved and legalistic joint statement after 2 days of negotiations in Switzerland. First point, the fact of these negotiations alone was significant progress, because they were sort of, I try and think of a better phrase for this, but it definitely was a Mexican standoff like Reservoir Dogs between the Chinese and the Americans, where they were just holding out a gun to each other and waiting to, I mean, it's three-way in Reservoir Dogs. But anyway, this is a rather elaborate, you get the picture, right? It's sort of mutually assured trade destruction, right? These were unbelievable tariffs. They were basically prohibitive. They stopped trade, almost if you got from 100 to 140, it doesn't really matter. Very little is flowing, and we saw the consequences of that. What happened today was that these were taken down. The great bulk of them were taken down. And my latest understanding of that legalistic context is that they've been cancelled, the great bulk of them. So if you like, the tit for tat that went up and up and up and up and up ever higher. And we are left with that reciprocal tariff of 34%, with 24% of that on both sides suspended for 90 days, down to what? Down to the 10% baseline level that the UK enjoys, for example.
enjoys not being at
enjoys
work.
exactly, yeah, enjoys. No, it's true. The way that the White House depicts this is now getting into my head. You're right. The pleasure of the 10% tariff. You're absolutely right. And there's a 90-day negotiation over that. And just the first thing I would say is at the time when the Chinese retaliated for the first time against the Americans, 34 for 34, the American went out and said, oh, hang on, if you retaliate, you're going to be treated very, very badly, very harshly. We're going to go all the way up the escalation. No. You have to not retaliate if you want a good deal. So where we're left here, and we'll come on to this, but where we're left here is extremely interesting in how this will be judged by other major trade partners, including allies.
Right. But before that, Laura, how's it being seen there? Because as Faisal says, the one question that we all want an answer to is who blinked here? Did Xi blink or did Trump blink? How's it being seen in Beijing?
Look, having worked in both countries, I would say both have blinked. How it's being seen here is that the US has blinked. Certainly when it comes to what the message has been in kind of state media and the message that's kind of going across social media, Chinese social media, is that the United States initiated these negotiations. The United States needs China. The United States did not like China's defiant response. We are doing this to be the responsible global country. We've dug our heels in and been defiant to show the rest of the world what can be done when you stand up to a bully. And this is the result. The bully has had to cave. That is the message that state media would like you to believe. That's the message officials would like you to believe. The problem is, behind the scenes, it's a bit different. And that is because when it comes to China's economy, at the moment, it's not doing as well as it has done over the last 2 decades. It's not growing in the same way. It's still growing, but it's certainly not growing in the same way. And you're looking at things like high youth unemployment rate. About 1 in 5 young people can't get a job. You're looking at problems with consumer spending, low consumer confidence. That generally means that folk are just not putting their hands in their pockets and going out and spending. And one of the reasons for that is the other big problem that Beijing's trying to grapple with, and that is a property crisis. Property prices here have crashed, and a lot of the middle classes shoved all their money into their property and they've just watched it decrease over the last 5 or 6 years. Also, to create jobs, to create industry, construction companies kept on building even though there wasn't any demand. So you've got all of these empty houses. These are the kind of economic problems that Beijing is trying to grapple with. What they do not want is for consumer confidence to sink any further. And a global trade war does not help that battle. They are very sensitive when it comes to this. So I do think that behind the scenes officials have been slightly concerned about the effect these tariffs are having on the economy and have decided to head to the negotiating table. They have also softened their tone. And I think when Donald Trump said that he was prepared to lower tariffs, that was the key for Beijing officials to act.
And Laura, just tell us a little bit more about what Faisal mentioned, which is this imbalance between the two economies, with what, China regarded as the workshop of the world, the United States regarded, I suppose, as the world's consumer in many respects. Just tell us a bit about how important that has been to the growth of the Chinese economy in the last, 10, 20 years or so.
It has been pivotal. China has still been an export-driven economy, even as it's trying to sell domestically. Look, when it comes to its exports, half of its GDP in the last year has come from this export drive. It sells about 4 times as much to the United States than it buys. And that's the real key for Donald Trump. He doesn't like that trade imbalance. He really wants to spike that. And that has been a problem for China. So in the past, when they sat down to do a deal, the deal that they agreed to was that Beijing would buy around $200 billion worth more of US goods. Now, it fell apart during COVID, it fell apart during the pandemic, but that was the agreement they came to. Now, initially, when Donald Trump took power, took the White House, certainly when it came to Beijing, they thought, you know what, we'll have a better relationship. He seems to have, or believe that he's got this really good relationship with President Xi. Perhaps there's room for negotiation. He even invited President Xi to the inauguration. So Beijing wondered whether all of this trade rhetoric that happened during Donald Trump's certainly campaign, they thought, maybe it's just big words. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more softer than they thought, but they had prepared for this. They have been ready for this. So when it comes to how it's propelled its economy, over the last 5 years, trade with the United States has meant less to China since Donald Trump's last term. And that is because they saw what happened. They saw that they couldn't rely on the United States. And so many companies have gone, look, let's find other ways to grow, or let's find other places to manufacture. So there's been this big shift to the likes of Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, where they're making stuff there, then sending it to the United States. And of course, there's been this big push to try to look for other customers, about 10% of China's exports in the last quarter have gone to the likes of Central Asia. So you're looking at a country that's looked for other customers. I think they're the lead trade partner now for 120 other countries. So they have looked abroad, but that export drive, that kind of workshop of the world, that is still China. And they're moving towards higher goods. And I think this is what's triggered America. America's worried, okay, we had that first flood of goods. You had that, perhaps toys, electronics, small things. Now China's beginning to make humanoid robots, electric cars, solar panels. In fact, they are the biggest producer of solar panels and electric cars in the world. And that worries America because they do not want a second flood of goods.
Faisal, you're nodding.
Yes, and the dynamics of this played out within the administration. This is really important to remember this. I mentioned this guy, Pete Navarro, and he was the architect of that infamous chart in the Rose Garden. It was only April the 2nd, and we're mid-May now, to think that the roller coaster that we've been through. And essentially what happened, and I was out in the States during this period, was that the response to that, not just and the escalation with China, was pretty violent in the US government treasury market, so the markets for US government debt. Now, we traditionally think of that as being almost the epitome of safety, kind of is where the whole world goes to whenever there's a crisis. So the crisis in that market, even hinted at, is an extraordinary thing. It was happening. And it was happening as a result of this, not just the actual tariffs, but the total uncertainty about US policy. And I think what you saw at that point, so we're talking now 3 or 4 weeks ago, was a pivot from the White House. And in personnel terms, we shouldn't over-personalise these things, but it is relevant here, is away from this guy, this sort of mega protectionist who was behind this, Pete Navarro, towards the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. And it was put in his hands. And he talked the talk on tariffs, but no one really believes that he's a true believer. He's a hedge fund guy, big macroeconomist. And he has started these negotiations. And at that time, what was happening with the likes of the US retailers, Walmart, Target, were going in to the White House and saying, there is a genuine risk of empty shelves here. There are going to be empty cargo ships leaving where Laura is, heading over the Pacific, or no cargo ships at all. That has come to pass. The physical kind of manifestation of these extraordinary tariff rates, prohibitive tariff rates, we will still see that over the next few weeks. But now you've got potentially a different problem, which is everybody rushing to restart the exports, and a sort of potentially pandemic minor inflationary problem. I say minor, I don't know. We've never been in this situation before. And there's the other thing I hinted at, which is it turns out, just based on that chart, that 34% retaliation, bottom line, the Chinese have got the 34% down to 10, right? Which is the same rate applied to the UK. Now, if you're the rest of the world and you were told don't retaliate, the people that retaliate are going to get harshly treated. You have to not retaliate. The minimum you want is 10%. If the Chinese have got 10%, so I think it makes the conversations for the Americans now a little more tricky, or maybe it just means the whole thing is going to be wound back down to the still significant 10% universal tariff on everybody.
But the big question is, and I put it to both of you, and I unfortunately don't really expect either of you to be able to tell newscasters what the answer is.
Low expectations.
Will it last?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You can easily see this, in some, the other person to play into this is Elon Musk in the administration, who's clearly deeply worried about the consequences for his business in China and also his supplies. It is worth noting, actually, the Americans have won something from the Chinese. Laura may have some more detail on this, which is the embargo on rare earths, critical minerals that are necessary for the supply chain for very many advanced manufacturers. They've stopped that. Now, the extent to which this is a port, and then the bigger point is this: we were told that there was going to be a massive ultimate big negotiation of the two world economic superpowers over things like exchange rates, over things like, big imbalances, the way in which the Chinese use the state to direct investment.
Like subsidies and so on.
Subsidies. And the big picture is this, do the Americans want to stop China on their path? We were always happy when China, as the West, were making our T-shirts, then our TVs, EVs, we're a little less happy.
Yeah.
Microchips, maybe not. Security infrastructure, oh, well, no, dear chap, we'll have to think about something else we need to do. Obviously, the Chinese are saying, do you know what? We've invested in these things. We have used the state. We are churning out millions of PhD scientists in STEM areas. In some areas where the Americans, the West, would have a natural, would be naturally successful, AI, Silicon Valley, they have shown some promise from their own methods. So I think the big strategic question we're left with, which will underpin whether this is the end of everything, is what are the Americans trying to achieve here? Are they actually trying to stop and sort of prevent the Chinese from developing beyond a certain point, a line which they have drawn, or is this merely about a trade deficit number and managing it down to zero, which Pete Navarro said was his aim?
Laura, what do you think?
I think the perception here in China is that the US is trying to contain it, that the West is trying to contain it. I think what this crisis has done is give Beijing an opportunity that it hasn't had in years. It's given Beijing an opportunity to look like a global responsible leader. It's given Beijing an opportunity and President Xi an opportunity to say to the world, look, who do you want to do business with? Do you want to do business with this American president who seems unpredictable, a country that changes president every 4 years, or do you want to do business with a stable partner, we the Chinese? That is what China is selling now. And I think when it comes to all the things that Faisal's just mentioned, when it comes to artificial intelligence, they've shown what they can do with DeepSeek. When it comes to so-called high-end products, the kind of things that President Xi has demanded factories now kind of output, things like solar panels, EV vehicles, electric vehicles. So these are the kind of things that China wants to kind of sell to the world now. They're already world leading at it. The difference here for China is that when it comes to digging your heels in and being defiant, if people kind of lose faith, they've got no polling booth to go to. They have one president, one leader, whereas in the US it changes every 4 years. So this message of stability that is trying to come out of Beijing is one that it's now trying to cozy up to Europe and say to Europe, look, we can do a trade deal, we can do business in a way that during the pandemic, during its so-called wolf warrior phase, where it was lashing out at certain countries, it couldn't do. Because it was very sensitive about accusations of the origins of COVID. It was very sensitive about accusations of genocide in Xinjiang. So all of these things kind of created a wolf warrior. That wolf warrior is gone now. And you're looking at a Beijing that's saying, come and visit. Here's a free visa. Come and do business with us. And then trying to look as if it's look kind of this softened Beijing in comparison to quite a hardline Washington.
Yes, and we don't need to say, but just for the record, there's a lot more to China than that. And next time you're on, I'm sure we'll be talking about some of the other sides of China as well, Laura. But I take your point. You're putting forward the case that they are putting forward as the regime.
That's what they are saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Faisal, look, just finally for newscasters, what does this affect us here in the UK, and if so, how?
Massively. As it has been one of the most fundamental underpinnings of everything in the world has been this relationship between China and the US in this 21st century. When China was invited and joined the World Trade Organization, it changed the rules of the game across the world economy. It helped inflation come down for the first 10, 15 years of this century. And it underpinned living standards in the West. And now this process has its own momentum. And the West is trying to work out exactly how far. I guess we sort of assumed in the West that China wouldn't develop this fast under the governance model that it has. That it's inherent to democracies and science and free thinking to get to the most advanced levels of development. they're sort of disproving that. And these are the tensions that we're seeing. That has an impact on our living standards. It has an impact on big decisions, strategic, that we're going to have to make. Do we let in these electric vehicles en masse? Our decision in the UK is yes, we do. Essentially, we have not tariffed them like other countries. Do we let China, with its bountiful foreign exchange reserves, invest some of those in the UK? Yes, in some areas. Is it no in others? You know, what is our? Are we going to allow ourselves, if the Americans, having sort of rode back from a direct confrontation, tries to seek another way to make this confrontation happening, which is to get the G7 on side and everybody sort of pressurizing China? You know, that is another pressure. We've seen there was a clause in the US-UK deal that was struck last week. It wasn't a particularly hard clause, but there was some sort of consultation required in terms of what's traded with the US if there's Chinese ownership in the supply chain. Do we accept fundamentally these millions of STEM PhDs, these science and engineering and technology coming out of China? And, you know, the strategy a few years back was to be part of that business. What a great export for the UK to help China educate themselves in this area. Now it seems the reverse is true, which is, you know, maybe we shouldn't do this. There's a number of very strategic choices which kind of whittle down to, we have a special relationship with the US. Will that determine what our relationship with China will be? And that has consequences for investment, has consequences for trade, has consequences for where our jobs will be. You know, so bottom line is yes, it does hugely matter.
Yeah, and on those 300 almost impossible questions, we will leave it. Faisal, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
Laura, lovely to see you. Thank you.
Lovely to speak to you, James.
Thank you.
I know we keep saying this, but there really is a lot happening in the world at the moment, and we've just talked there about two huge issues, trade and immigration. And if it wasn't for the focus on that, perhaps the thing that's rumbling along in the background might be getting a bit more attention. And that thing rumbling along closer to the end than it was to the start is the UK COVID inquiry. And the inquiry, newscasters, wants you to get involved with something called Every Story Matters. And we're going to talk about that now with the Secretary to the UK COVID inquiry, Ben Connah. Hi, Ben.
Hello, James.
Thanks very much for coming in. Because I imagine you're busy because you've been involved in this very detailed, already reasonably long-running public inquiry. Ben, can you just remind us where we are with it at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So newscasters will remember that Boris Johnson set up a public inquiry. He announced its creation in the middle of 2022. Baroness Hallett was appointed as chair. She's a retired senior Court of Appeal judge. And she is the person who determines how the inquiry is going to be run. And very early on, she took two key decisions. One was that, given that COVID had affected everybody in the United Kingdom, we needed to be out and about, talking to people, hearing their stories, so that she could build a proper picture of the human impact of COVID. And the other decision she took is that rather than doing all of our work and then making a set of recommendations at the end of the inquiry, she would report as she goes. So she's got a very, very broad scope that was set by government, but she's decided to do it in bite-sized chunks. And today, for example, we start the 7th of our investigations into test, trace and isolate.
It seems like a pretty massive undertaking. For that reason, Ben, as you say, and as newscasters will remember, I mean, this podcast was dedicated to the issue of coronavirus for a long time. It touched on so many aspects of people's lives. It must have been difficult to decide what to focus on and what direction to take, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely right. The government set a really, really broad scope, something called our terms of reference, that touches on just about every aspect of public life and all of the areas that government was needing to make decisions. So breaking it up into 10 different investigations, we call them modules, is the way that Baroness Hallett decided she would approach this. And she was clear from day one that she wants to make sure that any recommendations that need to be attended to by government quickly are made as soon as possible. So rather than waiting till we get to the end, she's reporting as we go. She published her first report last year into whether the UK was prepared for a pandemic and how it should prepare better next time. The next report, which will touch on core government decision making, will be published in a few months' time.
Now, we had on Newscast last week Dame Jenny Harris, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, but also she was, as we were hearing, she was very involved in test and trace and all these other names that even I wonder even if people remember what test and trace is now. When you say things like that, these were phrases that were so common and we were so used to talking about. But my point about that was, it's 5 years ago now. I mean, you think about Dame Jenny Harris coming on and talking about her memories. I mean, she's got a professional background in it and she's been deeply involved in it and presumably she's kept notes and so on. But if you have been talking, as you have, or the inquiry has, to just generally people across the country asking for their stories and to tell you what they thought, can you be sure that you can rely on people's memories this long out from what happened?
One of the great things about Every Story Matters, which is our nationwide listening exercise, is that we've heard from thousands and thousands of people. And so even if one person has a slightly dodgy memory, the other, well, in this case, 58,000 people that we've heard from can correct that. So we're pretty sure that the stories that we're hearing through Every Story Matters are true accounts of the experiences that people had. It's been really interesting going around the country and now reading the latest Every Story Matters record that's published today about test and trace. Some things that I'd completely forgotten about. There are things like the pingdemic that we all remember, but having to drive to a test centre to get my first test, the app that told you how many days left you had to self-isolate, and that terrible countdown before you were allowed out again. It's all come flooding back to me.
Yeah.
We've also heard some, a bit more texture to that. Some of the feelings that people had at the time, the loneliness of people who were self-isolating, the nerves that people had when they tested positive. Also some positives. There's a real theme in the record about people feeling like they were doing the right thing, like they were somehow discharging their obligation to their fellow person in the UK by making sure they were testing and when they were positive by isolating.
But reading through it, I had a sense of a couple of things that maybe aren't quite as positive. And one was that idea that some people were very much trapped and that, we were just having a chat in the Newscast office earlier about how, for some of us, the first lockdown, for example, people were having quite a nice time, and I have a garden. I'm very lucky. I had a reasonable amount of space, and the children were able to run about outside. And for other people, and this comes through in reading some of the testimony, people found it difficult, especially if they were stuck, for example, as I think I read one woman talking about with a violent partner. There's a real difference in experience, a dramatic difference in experience between different people across the country, isn't there?
This is one of the things that we found in just about every topic that we've looked into through Every Story Matters is the different experiences that people had. There are some people who consider themselves to be very lucky about the time that they had during COVID. There are others who definitely had it very, very bad indeed. It's been really humbling to talk to, well, I've talked to hundreds, we've heard from thousands of people who lost loved ones during the pandemic. And also people who, like you say, were trapped with abusive partners or found themselves really struggling with their mental health. I think people have been really brave in sharing their stories. And one of the things I want to do today is to ask newscasters to do the same. If you've been thinking about sharing your story with the inquiry, but you've not quite been sure that we'd want to hear it, we do. Every single story matters because it helps us to build a picture. Every Story Matters is only going to be open for another 11 days. So if you've not done it yet, please do it now. You can go to everystorymatters.co.uk and share your story. And by doing so, you build that picture, and you give us a bit of texture about how the pandemic affected you, your community, wherever you are in the UK, and your family.
And just to be clear, just to explain the mechanics of this, of Because presumably when you're coming up with a public inquiry, as you were saying at the start, first of all, you have to decide what you want to look at, but you also have to decide the mechanics of how you're going to do that. And this Every Story Matters was a key part of that, I guess. But can you just explain a bit more about what Every Story Matters is and why that's part of the inquiry and how it works? Every
Story Matters is one of the ways that Baroness Hallett can gather evidence to support her recommendations. So you'll have seen in fact, I think you've been to our hearing centres around the country. We hold evidential hearings, we hear from witnesses, and they're cross-examined by lawyers. But we also get around the country to talk to people in their own communities in a slightly more informal setting to hear from them about their pandemic. And we've had an ongoing online offering as well on everystorymatters.co.uk where people can share their stories. Every single story that's shared with us is collated and analysed, and they form the basis for records that are published alongside the start of each of our sets of hearings. Today, Module 7's record is published, and that will form part of the evidence base for that module. And it will be one of the things that Baroness Hallett can rely on when she's making her recommendations. Right.
And talking of those recommendations, I mean, you mentioned the inquiry I was at. I was in the Edinburgh International Conference Centre when Nicola Sturgeon, among others, was giving evidence. I mean, she's gone from office now. Loads of people who were involved are gone from office. What does the inquiry say to the criticism that actually it takes so long to do these things that we won't have any meaningful justice, if that's what people are looking for, or holding to account is maybe a better way of putting it, because almost everyone involved will have disappeared?
Public inquiries do take time. There's no getting away from that. But they exist to look in detail and in depth at matters of real public importance, like a pandemic. Our inquiry doesn't exist to highlight the particular failings of individual politicians. That might happen, but what we're here to do is make sure that the United Kingdom is better prepared next time there's a pandemic. That's a job that we've got to take seriously.
So it's not about individuals, it's about systems. Is that a fair shorthand?
A lot of this is about systems. Sometimes it will be about individual posts or offices. You know, what is the role of a Prime Minister or a First Minister during a pandemic, and what should it be? But really, this is making sure that in every aspect of the government's response to a pandemic, they do it better next time where there are failings identified.
And it's interesting that you mention a Prime Minister or a First Minister, because one of the other things that comes through in reading some of these stories is there were different systems in different parts of the UK, and some people will make the case for that. Some newscasters will think that that is right and proper in a devolution, in a world of devolution, and other people might suggest that it was quite confusing and that perhaps a more cohesive approach across the UK would be appropriate. And I'm not expecting you as a civil servant to comment on this, but I thought that Baroness Hallett, when I was listening to her in the very brief snippet of the inquiry I was sitting in, was certainly asking some very pointed questions on those subjects. So how the nations of the UK work together is part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is, yeah. And that was a big part of Module 2, the module that held its hearings in Edinburgh as well as in Cardiff, Belfast and London, was looking at how those four nations were working together. You'll know that there was a lot of commonality to the approach very early on in the pandemic when everybody locked down on the same day. That changed over the course of time, and one of the questions that Baroness Hallett will be looking at is whether that divergence was right.
Now, we asked, as I think you heard the Jenny Harris episode,
That's
didn't
right.
you? We of Newscast, and we were asking her if she did any of the classic COVID things. You know, people were what was it, banana bread?
Yeah.
What else was there? There were quizzes. We did what do you call it an escape room? We did a virtual escape room with my family in different parts of the world. Did you do any of that?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, I was amazed by Dame Jenny's answer, because I know how busy she was during the pandemic, and I was too. But yeah, the quizzes that we attempted to do on Zoom with different groups of friends largely fell into disrepair as soon as they started. For some reason, we couldn't get ourselves into a place where we were sorting it out. Cooking was our big thing. The number and the extravagance of the dishes that we were creating during the pandemic just grew and grew.
Ben, thank you very much. It's really interesting to get that insight into how this is all working. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, James.